Hi, welcome to the LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project meeting. My name is Kynan Thistlethwaite, and I will be your moderator for today. Given the rapid developments in the U.S. Congress, particularly, where this is a fight over the role of the United States sending arms and money to Ukraine, there's a specific locus of concentration in the next days, which the LaRouche Organization in particular is leading. That locus of concentration is in the U.S. Congress. All Americans, including those not of voting age, must now petition the Congress to withdraw funds from the British-orchestrated world war against Russia. The sudden appearance of the American people, much like the Prometheus of the Greek playwright Aeschylus, who suddenly seized fire from the Olympian tyrant Zeus, has the power to end the lifeline of dirty weapons that has been needlessly prolonging this conflict in Ukraine, and therefore will end it entirely. Helga Zepp LaRouche, in her webcast this Wednesday, responded to the skepticism of some who question whether peace negotiations are even possible given the fragmenting relationship between the Russia and the West. So you can play that.
We're continuing to get a certain amount of skepticism about the possibility for a negotiated settlement. I won't go through all the questions, but just a couple of them you may or may not want to comment on. From Jay in the chat room, he basically says, why would Russia negotiate with the West after all the broken promises? Then we have one from James Stewart who asks, how can the anti-war movement in any political party be heard when people refuse to accept the reality of the situation due to wartime propaganda? So if you'd like to comment on either of those, then we can move on to a couple of other questions on the BRICS.
Well, I know that is a very common view in Russia by people who look at it from the standpoint of Russian interest. And they, are very harsh. And for example, the statement by the 4 Germans starts with basically, saying that the not unprovoked, but the war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine. And many people, take issue with that formulation. I think that the next sentence in that paper is, nevertheless, reason must prevail. So don't get hung up on that first sentence because, what do you think? Mr. Kuyat was the highest military committee of NATO. He was the highest military person of the German Bundeswehr. Horst Helschig is of a conservative tradition of the Christian Democrats. Don't expect people to not say something which they feel has to appeal to what the majority of the population thinks. But it's just one sentence, and the whole rest is, basically very constructive and aimed to win over the people of their own, political factions in Germany. Now, I'm certain that, I have not talked to the motives, to the 4 authors about their motives in writing it the way they did. But I'm pretty sure that, they want to stop the war, and they know perfectly well that the escalation comes from NATO. It's obvious so that nobody can miss the point. So what do you do? The Russians are determined to win on the battleground, but NATO, at least, up to now, people like Stoltenberg and Baerbock and these people, they said we have to ruin Russia. Russia has to be made completely, unable to continue this policy. Basically, if both and Ukraine must win. So if you have 2 sides who both say that they have to win, then you are on the course of World War III. If, however, the Kuyat, Telschik, Funke, Brandt proposal gains so much momentum that it does impact this extremely fluid strategic situation, and that some negotiation can be arranged, because you have Lula, you have the African states, you have the Vatican, you have Erdogan, you have the Chinese proposal. I mean, that's a lot of people who are in motion, and if all these forces can be put together and a negotiation can actually take place, well, I think that the aim is to convince the war faction in the West, to weaken them and to get those people to the foreground who want to stop the war. And then the Russians will look at it completely different. I mean, look, I know that if Russia would see anything in the West worthwhile regaining trust, I'm absolutely sure that they would go back to the kind of negotiation which was on the table in March 22, where Zelensky had agreed to it. Erdogan had mediated. There was actually the idea of, having a neutral Ukraine. So then Boris Johnson came to Kiev and everything was nixed. The Minsk process. I mean, there were efforts which could have led to a peaceful resolution. So I'm convinced that if this is gaining momentum, that the Russian position will change. But the Russian position only will change if there is a very credible force in Europe, in the United States, or at least in Europe, because without Europe, the United States could really not carry this through, to stop it. And I think people should really give up the idea that you can't do anything anyway, because if Germany, for example, would move forcefully in the direction of the proposal of these four people, the war would stop, because all of Europe would follow. Look at what is happening. The new election winner in Slovakia, Robert Fico, who was 2 times prime minister already before, he's eminently for stopping the weapon sales to Ukraine. He's for peace negotiations, and he has a good chance of forming the next government. Hungary, the same thing. And, in France, the mood is very explosive and could go either way. Italy, you have a tremendous battle. So the key is really Germany. And I think, people should really have the sense it can be done. And the ouster of McCarthy should be an example of what you do with politicians who are war hawks.
I think it's very clear from what you just said, Helga, that our viewers have a responsibility now to drop their questions and become more actively involved in the organizing.
The American economist, statesman, and 8-time presidential candidate Lyndon LaRouche once wrote, "If one proposed to force existing governments to directly implement a certain policy, the task must seem formally an impossibility. Yet, if the possibility for a rapid succession of intermediating developments is clearly understood, no such difficulty as initially appears to prevail stands in our way." Consider if that statement true, and if so, are the American people or those in Europe under the thumb of the London-Washington axis capable of overthrowing the neoliberal dictatorships that have declared, without their electorate's permission, world war on Russia? Helga Zepp LaRouche, in a meeting with the International Peace Coalition this week, referenced that 37 years ago, yesterday, there was a raid conducted against Lyndon LaRouche and his associates, involving more than 400 armed personnel. On August 31st and September 1st, in 1995, 2 days of public hearings were convened to investigate allegations of gross misconduct by the U.S. Department of Justice against Lyndon LaRouche. Those independent hearings were facilitated by the Schiller Institute to discuss what the House Judiciary Committee and others were unwilling to discuss publicly. Lyndon LaRouche was one of the speakers for those hearings, and he spoke about his organization's role in organizing the world and why, in fact, he had been prosecuted. So play that, please.
I was born in September 1922 in Rochester, New Hampshire, lived there for the first 10 years of my life. live for the next 22 years of my life in Lynn, Massachusetts, except for service overseas. I moved to New York City, where I lived until July of 1983. And since that time, except for a period of incarceration, I have been a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I attended university a couple of times during the course before the war, or at the beginning of the war and after it, and then had a career in management consulting, which lasted until about 1972, tapered off, sort of. My most notable professional achievement was developed during the years 1948, 1952, in certain discoveries of a fundamental scientific nature in respect to economics. And my professional qualifications are essentially derived from that. In the course of time, in 1954, 64 approximately, I was persuaded that things were being done to change the United States, which, from my view, were the worst possible disaster which could befall this nation. And thus, while I had given up any hope of political improvement of this country before then to speak of, I felt I had to do something. So I became involved part-time from 1966 through 1973 in teaching a course, a one-semester course in economics, largely on the graduate level at a number of campus locations, chiefly in New York City, but also in Pennsylvania. In the course of this, a number of the students who participated in these classes became associated with me. And out of this association came the birth of a nascent political organization, as much a philosophical organization as political. Our essential commitment was third world issues and related issues. That is, that the economic justice for what is called the third world is essential for a just society for all nations. I became particularly attached to this during military service overseas in India, where I saw what colonialism does to people. And I was persuaded at the time, as I believe a majority of the people who were in service with me, was that we were coming to the end of a war which we had not foreseen, for which we had been obliged to fight, and that if we allowed these circumstances to prevail that I saw in the third world, we would bring upon ourselves some kind of disaster, either war or something comparable down the line. And that was essentially our commitment as an association. We became rather unpopular with a number of institutions, including McGeorge Bundy's Ford Foundation. About 1969, we made a mess of a few projects he was funding by exposing them. And we also became unpopular with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, perhaps on the behest of McGeorge Bundy. In 1973, there was, according to a document later issued under the Freedom of Information Act by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting at all times under supervision of Washington headquarters, hatched a plot to have me eliminated or to induce the Communist Party USA that my elimination would solve a number of their problems. There actually was an abortive attempt on me during that period. And later, of course, I knew the FBI had been involved. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew it. And later a document appeared showing that. From that point on, during the 1970s, until the end of COINTELPRO, we were constantly beset by the FBI. Our main weapon against the FBI was jokes. We used to make some jokes about the FBI, which we would pass around to try to persuade them to keep off our tail, but they kept coming, and all kinds of harassment. The motivations of the case against us, I think, are in part obvious, perhaps partly not. In 1982-83, there were two things which greatly excited my enemies. Number one, I had been involved in 1982 in presenting a proposal which is based on my forecast in the spring of 1982 that a major debt crisis would break out in South America, Central America, and the expectation that Mexico would be the nation that would have a debt crisis. I've been involved with many of these countries and personalities in them in projecting alternatives to this kind of inequitable system where colonial nation had been replaced as a term by debtor nation. And the debt of South America, Central America, was largely illegitimate, that it was a debt which had not been incurred for value received, but had been done under special monetary conditions under the so-called floating exchange rate system, where somebody would come, bankers would come to a country, the IMF in particular, and say, we just wrote down the value of the currency, we're now going to refund your financing of your foreign debt, which you can no longer pay on the same basis as before. So I propose that the debt crisis be used as the occasion for united action by a number of governments of South and Central American countries to force a reform in the international debt relations and to force a reform within international monetary relations. This report was entitled Operation Warz, largely because of the relationship of President Lincoln to Mexico during the time that Lincoln was president, with the idea that it was in the interest of the United States to accept and to sponsor such a reform, to assist these countries in the freedom to resume development of the type which they had desired. And this report was published in August of 1982, ironically a few weeks before the eruption of the great Mexico debt crisis of '82. And was presented also to the U.S. government, the National Security Council, for the president's information at that time. There was some effort on the part of the president of Mexico to implement my proposal in the initial period of the debt crisis. He had at that time some support from the president of Brazil and the government of Argentina. But under pressure from the United States, the government of Brazil and Argentina capitulated, and President Jose Lopez Portillo, the president of Mexico, was left, shall we say, hanging out to dry. As a result, in October of 1982, he capitulated to the terms which were delivered to his government and people around him by people such as Henry A. Kissinger, who made a trip to Mexico at that time to attempt to intimidate the Mexicans to submitting to these new terms. This was one issue between me and Kissinger and his friends. The second issue was that sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted, according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1983, or 82 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with. On the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense, which I had this proposal which the president adopted, at least initially, in the form of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by the president on March 23rd, 1983, there were a lot of people out for my scalp. Those are the at least contributing factors in what happened to me. But they may not be all. There probably are others as well.
Great. I want to introduce us to our panel for today. We have Dennis Speed, leader of the Manhattan Project, who usually moderates, but I'm filling in today, and Mike Robinson of the UK column, who is also a frequent guest at our meetings. Dennis, I'll go to you first, and you can take it away.
Well, thank you, Kynan. I want to thank everybody for being with us today. It's a particularly important week that faces the world, actually. And this week, we need to make the Congress of the United States work. Whatever one may think about the particular individuals, whatever one may think about what is called the chaos scenario that has erupted there, it is now possible, and it is necessary and urgent for the American people to stand up and to show up, in forcing the Congress to stop the world war with Russia. Now, there's something that people keep referring to as the Ukraine war. My own view personally is that that should be removed from people's vocabulary. There is no Ukraine war. There is a world war with Russia. Now, neither the American war with Ukraine nor the American war with Russia have been declared, but of course that's been kind of par for the course for the last several decades, with the Congress of the United States abdicating its constitutional responsibility to be responsible for actually making war, that is declaring war, and that no longer goes on. And under the deceptive cloak of allowing the presidency certain powers, the Congress abdicates its powers regularly. This, however, now threatens to possibly cause the entire world to blow up. But on the other hand, we want to say to the American people, voting and non-voting, that the interminable bluster about freedom that's bellowed around the world by American and European institutions about democracy and how important the democratic process in American politics is, it's now about to be put to the test. And the test has to be both given by the American people, and it is a test of the American people. And the question before us all, whether we like it or not, is, will the American people take back their government in order to stop World War III? Now, the sleeping giant that is the American electorate, as well as the American population as a whole, has to be reawakened. And the specific locus of concentration in the next days is the United States Congress. Now, there are various ways in which one might try to intervene. Sometimes it makes sense for people to get in a car and go to Washington. And whatever may be the prohibitions against doing that these days. And sometimes it means going to your local congressional office and standing in front of it with a sign that says no world war with Russia, for example. Various forms of action, nonviolent and direct but creative, need to be taken up by Americans right now. And in that context, if that were done, we might actually survive the process. And this means all Americans, including those even not of voting age. If you're 13 years old and you are able to think, you need to petition the Congress to withdraw funds from the British orchestrated world war against Russia. You know, Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution, the United States Constitution, makes it clear that it is the Congress and not the president that has the power to declare war and to raise and support armies. Now, it's true that the president, of course, has also powers with respect to time of war, and that, of course, is traditional from the time of George Washington. But the actual appropriation of money for that purpose was left in the hands of the Congress, because it was well known from the experience of history and of empires throughout history that it was a normal thing for kings to appropriate monies from populations against their will on the pretext that they had to be defended from some external force. I mean, Henry V, the play by Shakespeare, begins with a group of prelates trying to figure out how to stop Henry from taking the money from the parishes of the churches, and they wanted to figure out a way to stop him from essentially usurping the power of the landed clergy. So what they did was to devise a way for him to go to war against France. That's the actual beginning of the play. And while people like to talk about the great hero Henry V, the truth of the matter is that he's manipulated into a war. It's a tragedy, as opposed to the notion of some sort of Rambo. You know, Henry V is Rambo. That's not the conception at all. It's a conception of tragedy in which there's a manipulation of the monies of the population, the wealth of the society for war. That's what has been going on for the American people continually, such that the annual budgets of 11 states or 12 states are about the equivalent of what has already gone to Ukraine if you take just the legal the acknowledged over $100 billion plus that's gone, let alone other funds that have flowed in there. Now, we need a sudden appearance of the American people on the battlefield of this undeclared and therefore unconstitutional war. We have the power to end the conflict by ending the funding of it. And we're going to now tell you something that other media won't convey to you. Either they don't understand it or they are suppressing it. And it's a message that was delivered not merely to Russia and not merely to the Russian, the certain nations of the Eurasian Economic Union and so on, but was delivered to everyone by Vladimir Putin at the Valdai Discussion Club a few days ago. This is a group that holds meetings every year. It was having its 20th annual meeting. Vladimir Putin has attended all 20 such meetings. He delivered a 30-minute speech followed by a 3-hour question and answer period. And these were questions from the international press. Now, the topic of the meeting as a whole was called Fair Multipolarity, How to Secure Security and Development for Everyone. And during the question and answer period, Vladimir Putin took a question from Sergei Karaganov, or Karaganov, either way. I'm not sure how you pronounce his name. He's honorary chairman of Russia's Council on Foreign and Defense Policy. Now, he had caused a kind of wide-ranging controversy starting this past summer with his contention that by using its nuclear weapons, Russia could perhaps save humanity from a global catastrophe. That's nearly a quote, paraphrase of what he had said. But we have an actual quote from him, which we're going to give. This is just from his recent article of the last week. He said, "I don't see any other way to prevent a global war, and before that, an exhausting and costly military operation in Ukraine, except by strengthening reliance on nuclear containment, deterrence awakening. This may include not only the threat of retaliation against the territories of U.S. allies, but also, if necessary, against U.S. bases. We have almost no bases abroad. Washington's hawks and U.S. society must understand that retribution for their reckless and aggressive policy is inevitable. To achieve this, it is necessary first to promptly lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in our doctrine, which was blithely, if not irresponsibly, raised, and second, to cautiously but decisively move up the ladder of escalation deterrence, convincing both ourselves and the adversary of our readiness, if it does not work and the West does not retreat or revise its policy, to resort to the use of a few nuclear weapons against several countries in Europe that are most aggressively involved in supporting the Kiev junta. To reiterate, this is a terrible moral choice, and I pray to God that we do not have to make it." All right, and that's what he had to say. Now, before you jump to the conclusion that now confirms that Russia is intending to use nuclear weapons before the United States first, etc., this just echoes various documents and other matters, which we're not going to right now spend time quoting. We'll give some of these posters to you later, by various American NATO forces, which are talking about and have tried to resurrect the bankrupt doctrine of flexible response. It was an old idea about the notion of limited nuclear war. It's something that's being sort of revived by Blinken, by Nuland, and others in various ways through other spokespersons, some of whom we'll refer to, as I say, a little later. But what's important is we wanted to first just show you what Vladimir Putin did when he was questioned by this individual, Sergei Karaganov, when he was at Valdai, how he responded to him.
And now we know that there's a question being discussed here. I'll formulate it in this way. Do you think that our nuclear doctrine, do you think it's obsolete now? I think it's obsolete. And I think it's even, it's not suitable to the current events. It was created in the olden days and it doesn't work in the current situation. Do you think that we need to change our nuclear doctrine and reduce the threshold so there's containment containment approach is old. So they're directly saying, they're very brazen, our opponents, they're directly stating that because you've got this doctrine, we're going to continue this aggression. This is one question. Even when we win one way or another in Ukraine, I think the West will be going through very difficult times. There'll be new centers of power and there'll be new difficulties. We will need to put back that fuse into that nuclear weapons that was holding everyone back. Today, the West is trying to remove that fuse, forgetting all the fear and forgetting all the precautions. Do you think we need to change our policy in that? I am well aware of your position. I read some documents, your articles, your remarks, and I understand what you're feeling. I'd like to remind you that in the Russian military doctrine, there are two reasons of possible application of nuclear weapons by Russian Federation. First is the attack against us by nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons. In practice, what does that mean? When they launch their weapons, our system detects and informs that this is Russia is the target, and this happens within seconds. And knowing this information that there's an attack being launched against Russian Federation, we respond to this aggression. And I'd like to assure everyone that today the response would be completely unacceptable for any potential aggressor. Because from the moment of the start of any rocket from any point in the ocean or any territory, in response, there'll be so many hundreds of our rockets that there'll be no chance for survival for any of the adversaries. And this would be done in many directions, could be done in many directions. The second reason of using of such weapons is the threat to the existence of the Russian Federation, even if only conventional weapons are being used. But in case where the actual existence of Russia is being threatened. So these are two possible reasons for using nuclear weapons that you mentioned. Do we need to change this? Why? You can change anything, but I don't see any need for this. There's no such situation where something was threatening the existence of the Russian state. I don't think that any sane person would think about using nuclear weapons against Russia. Nevertheless, your point of view and point of view of other experts, people who are very patriotic, who are very passionate about what's going on within the country and around the country, those who are worried about what's going on at the front line in Ukraine. We understand all of that, and we are following very closely your point of view, and we respect it, but I don't see any reason for changing our concept. And our potential enemy knows about this. It knows our capabilities. Another thing is, for example, I hear that there are calls to start testing nuclear weapons, to come back to testing of nuclear weapons. Here's what I'd say here. The United States have signed a document, a corresponding document on banning the nuclear tests. And Russia signed it and ratified it. The United States signed it but did not ratify it. Now we practically finished the work on modern strategic armaments. I announced this several years ago. We have conducted the last successful test of Burevestnik. It's a rocket of global reach with a nuclear load. We have finished our work on Sarmat, which is a super heavy rocket. The question is that we have to simply go through certain bureaucratic procedures to complete this, and we have to move on to its mass production and putting it on military duty, and we will do that within a very short period of time. As a rule, experts say that new weapons, we have to make sure that the military payload works without fail, and we have to test. And I'm not prepared to say whether we need to test it or not, but I would like to reiterate that behaving in a mirroring the actions of the United States, when we signed and ratified, and they signed but not ratified, we can mirror their actions.
So now, as I said, we're going to tell you a bit about, so that's, you saw how Vladimir Putin answered. He rejected Karaganov's idea. He made it clear that the Russian policy is to throw hundreds, and he repeated hundreds of such weapons. So there's been no change in the Russian policy, but there is a Russian policy that if the state is threatened, including by conventional weapons, in other words, not merely nuclear weapons, that Russia does reserve the right to launch its entire nuclear arsenal against not only the people that perpetrate that attack, but any of their allies under that circumstance. Now, on the American side, let's just go and take a look at what's going on there, because something equally insane is being described, maybe in fact more insane, because actually it's the product of a war that's being prosecuted against Russia and China. And there's a person by the name of Gregory Weaver. Weaver is a retired member of the U.S. Senior Executive Service. He served as a federal senior executive on the U.S. Joint Staff in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and also at the United States Strategic Command. And he wrote an article, a recent article, called "The Urgent Imperative to Maintain NATO's Nuclear Deterrence." Now, when you're reading articles in the United States, usually you have more of a kind of double talk than you'll get in some of the things that come out in Russia. So I'm going to both read this, and I think we may have a printed version of this that you'll see. So bear with it. So I'll deconstruct the sophistry. There is a tendency among some in the West to make a perilously flawed assumption that deterrence of nuclear use is unlikely to fail, because if nuclear weapons are used at all, in any number or yield, and for any purpose, the war will rapidly escalate out of control to a catastrophic, large-scale exchange almost automatically. And then he says, in parentheses, it is, of course, possible that limited nuclear use could lead to uncontrolled escalation, but it is by no means certain and may not even be likely. Then he continues, this flawed assumption may lead to a flawed prescription, to rely primarily on the threat of uncontrolled nuclear escalation to deter Russian nuclear use at any level, ignoring Russia's strategy, the array of nuclear weapons that enable it, and the robust stability of central deterrence of large-scale Russia-U.S. homeland nuclear strikes. Now, what's relevant here is that you just heard what Russia's policy is from Vladimir Putin. But what is now come into existence is a discussion, and this was continued in Weaver's article, which we're not going to go into here, where he reintroduces the idea of flexible response. This is something that goes back to Maxwell Taylor. We're talking about the early 1960s. It was something that was rejected at the time by Eisenhower, for that matter, as well as clearly by Kennedy. And we don't have, again, useful thing here, but there's an article called The Myth of Flexible Response, United States Strategy in Europe During the 1960s, whose author just says that the strategy, which focused largely on the Soviet threat to Western Europe, was and is seen as a radical change which supposedly enhanced deterrence by providing the president with flexible nuclear options. This view of flexible response is widely held among both strategists and historians. However, the operational, no, forget that, we don't need that. The operational changes in U.S. strategy in Europe have been exaggerated from during the 1960s. And then it says recently declassified documents, in other words, things that were not available from the 60s, 70s, or 80s. Recently declassified documents and transcribed recordings reveal that senior officials, including the President and Secretary of Defense, this means Kennedy in specific, were not persuaded by the core strategic assumptions underlying the role of flexible response as they applied to the role of the United States. Like Eisenhower before them, they were not convinced that controlled nuclear war was possible. So while there is an attempt right now in the United States by Weaver and others to refer to this doctrine of flexible response, that doctrine was discredited at the time it first occurred. And the idea of limited nuclear war is an absurdity. Now, this does not mean that there are not mad or crazy people who would not, number one, attempt it or don't support it. What's important is that it means that the American people should show up at this stage because of what has erupted in the Congress of the United States. That is a moment where, because of the destabilization that has occurred in the House of Representatives, the actual feeling of the American people who are opposed to the war, and specifically opposed to any further funding of the war, can come to the fore. While many are thinking that this is merely a technical problem, that is not the case. What is the case is that this has created a massive political problem, which, for example, caused Joe Biden to hold an emergency meeting with over the phone, Zoom meeting, if you want to call it that, social media call, with Trudeau, with Sunak of Great Britain, a representative of France, Meloni of Italy, and others, to assure them that the United States was going to, no matter what the voters necessarily thought, that the United States would continue, or the electorate thought, would continue to support Ukraine and would finance the war. And that's because people in Europe don't believe that that's necessarily the case. And what needs to happen in the United States is that we have to create a circumstance where that indeed is not the case. Now, the problem involved, in part, that I think we have to confront is the control over media. This is something which is growing. There's greater censorship. There's censorship also of campaigns in one way or the other. For example, the RFK Jr. campaign, which has been largely censored, so much so that, in fact, ultimately, it looks like there's going to be an independent candidacy of that candidate who doesn't think he can run in his preferred party. And then there's the case of Donald Trump and the 4 indictments and all the other things that we all know. So that the process, when viewed from outside of the United States, is truly a dangerous one, an unpredictable one in which does not allow other countries to have policies toward the United States that they can trust are actually having any impact on stopping the United States and NATO. Let me be also very clear that this is something that comes out of financial forces in the city of London and Washington driving a process. And that process, which is something we can discuss a little bit later, of full-scale destabilization of the international financial system, a process that also sort of met its match when the sanctions that were used against Russia and other nations failed to, in fact, inflict the kind of damage that they thought they would inflict. This caused now a panic, a kind of a boomerang effect. And therefore, there are forces desperate enough to attempt to, in fact, propose and even launch limited nuclear war from NATO, not from Russia. Now, that is the possibility, and that is the thing that we must prevent at all costs. But we will need to find a way to get out the word of what we are talking to you about, what the president of Russia is saying to people. And therefore, all people who do blogging, all people who are on social media, anybody that has any other way of getting out the word should do so. And that should be done in the short term while the Congress is destabilized enough to be actually railroaded into taking rational and sane action, which is normally, it's not its normal behavior or specialty. So I'll stop there, and we'll have more to discuss in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That was a really great reality check, and I hope people will start mobilizing based on everything you just said. I want to bring on Mike Robinson, co-editor of the UK column. So just go ahead, Mike. It's good to see you.
Thank you. Well, I'm just going to start off with saying that, what Dennis referred there to the control of the media and so on. And it struck me as you were talking, Dennis, that what would the Western media's reaction be to Russia changing its doctrine on nuclear weapons? That would be presented as an act of war rather than an act of defense. And it would be done in a coordinated fashion right across the Western nations, right across Western media. It would be a pretty hard narrative to compete with. But increasingly, we are in a situation, not so much in the United States yet, because you still have constitutional protection over freedom of speech, but certainly in the UK, the EU, other parts of the world, the ability to counter these narratives becomes increasingly difficult. So the process, we've talked about it before on this program, but the process of narrative control really began in 2015 with a speech by David Cameron to the United Nations General Assembly, where he was very clear that it was time for full regulation of the internet. And that was in 2015. 2023, just a couple of weeks ago, the UK finally passed its online safety bill. This is the censorship legislation, which they've been trying to get through Parliament for 5 or 6 years and have failed, or at least it took them much longer than they hoped, because of the pushback from the general population against it and from activists and so on. Anyway, I want to just run through, first of all, the key aspects of this, the key sort of features of the online safety bill. Now, one of the previous times I spoke about this, I was talking about the concept of legal but harmful speech. This is speech that the government considered in its original draft of the online safety bill that they had to legislate against. That got such a pushback from people that they had to drop that idea, and instead they are now requiring platforms, that's the main platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and so on, to uphold the terms and conditions for community standards. Now, the issue with this is that they are backing that demand up with prison sentences potentially for non-compliance, prison sentences for managers within these companies, but also fines of up to 10% of global turnover. So that's not profit, that's turnover. So that's the first thing that it does that I wanted to highlight. The next thing is that Ofcom, this is the regulator of broadcast media and the telecommunications industry in the UK, has been made the chief censor. They are going to be the regulator of all speech on the internet and all activity on the internet. The other thing that we spoke about, I think one of the most recent times that I was on this program, was that the Act also includes a ban on end-to-end encryption. This is a mass surveillance enabling Act, enabling feature. And of course, the reason for this is that if you want to control a narrative, you've got to know what people are talking about. And increasingly, people are using WhatsApp and Telegram and so on, and these apps come with end-to-end encryption. Telegram doesn't have that on by default, but it still comes with it. So if you want to be able to track what people are saying, you've got to be able to get past the encryption. And so this bill is going to require the major platforms, Telegram, Signal, the rest, to provide government with access. The next feature is digital ID, because this comes part and parcel of this bill, facilitates that because they are requiring the ability to absolutely establish the age of users that are using various platforms. And then the final thing that I want to mention here is what I'm calling protest pens. And that is that, if we look at how the internet developed over the last 2 or 3 decades, after the creation of the World Wide Web, we began with a World Wide Web, which was a bunch of individual websites, which eventually morphed into more sort of dynamic content generation, which resulted in discussion forums and discussion groups. But they tended to be groups which were formed around particular topics. But once the big social media platforms came along, like Facebook and Twitter and so on, those enabled a cross-pollination of ideas between various people that we never saw before on the original version of the World Wide Web. So because everybody joined these platforms, then information got spread in a way that we had never seen before. One of the goals of the new censorship regime in the UK and other countries is to try to break this all up again and to put people back in walled garden silos and make sure that information doesn't spread from somebody who's discussing the Ukraine war to somebody who's maybe discussing how to grow potatoes in a garden. So that idea I'm calling protest pens, because the idea is to keep the conversation very much limited in scope. But on the issue in the UK with the online safety bill of the potential for prison sentences, it doesn't just apply to managers of the big platforms. It also applies to individuals. So I'm just going to give one example of that, and that is Section 180. And it says here, a person commits an offence if A, the person sends a message, so you've got to send a message, B, the message conveys information that the person knows to be false. Now, the bill doesn't, or the Act as it is now, does not define how anybody is supposed to know whether a piece of information that somebody has sent to somebody else was intentionally sent as knowing that it was false. And they go on to say, for example, that that message can be sent to a single individual, or it can be sent to any number of people, a group of people, and so on. So the sanctions for this, if they decide that I have, as an individual, have intentionally sent some false information, I am subject to prosecution, and I could be sent to prison for 6 months for each offence that they've decided that I've committed, and I could also be fined £5,000 for each offence that I am deemed to have committed. However, Section 181 says that a recognised news publisher cannot commit an offence under Section 180. So if we come back to this issue of what is false information, the government says that any suggestion that there's that Britain should not be funding or supplying weapons to Ukraine, that might be false information. Let's give that as an example. The mainstream press is very much pushing forward the idea that that those weapons should be sent. We could have a debate about which of those two arguments is false, but the point is that they can never be prosecuted for pushing out false information, whereas I can. So the UK column, for example, should we want this protection, would then have to submit to the regulatory regime and become a recognised news publisher. This helps to protect the mainstream news narratives. Now, I mentioned encryption. I just want to make the point that there was quite a bit of pushback on the encryption issue from many campaign groups, including Index for Censorship. They got a legal opinion on this, but what they said was that the bill, now the Act, contains some of the broadest and most powerful surveillance powers ever proposed in any Western democracy, that it's effectively a de facto ban on end-to-end encryption. And then they went on to talk about Section 104 notices. Now, I've just talked about Section 108, but Section 180 and Section 181. But Section 104 permits the government to ask the social media organizations to provide access to an encrypted discussion. They do that through a notice. There is a ban on the social media company communicating the fact that they've received that notice to the person who's the subject of that notice. So if the notice is about me and they want to read my encrypted messages to somebody else, they serve a notice on WhatsApp, for example. It would be a breach of the law for WhatsApp to tell me that they had received that notice. And of course, the organization which is going to be responsible for managing this will be Ofcom. But the other point that the King's Counsel had made was that this absolutely was of questionable legality. And the other point that they made very clearly was that this provided a failure to protect journalists, which is the ultimate irony, because the UK government is very much using the dangers to the lives of journalists in countries like Russia and Iran and other countries, claim dangers to the lives of journalists, to attack those countries and to justify the sanctions and so on that they impose on them in one respect. So sheer hypocrisy here. Now, we were talking about a second ago the fact that should Russia have changed their doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons, how a story would appear in the mainstream press, and it would be the identical story across mainstream outlets right across the Western world. And so I just want to remind everybody that this again was a British initiative, and this time was Theresa May who brought the idea to the G7 in June 2018. She called it the Rapid Response Mechanism. And this is, they were very, very clear about this. She was proposing, and it was accepted by the G7 countries, that they would agree a common narrative between them all, and that common narrative would be disseminated by all governments and therefore by all media, all mainstream media at least. And then I just want to bring this on screen again. We have shown this before, just to give you an idea of the scale or this form of the UK's censorship network at the moment. So we've got the intelligence agencies and the surveillance aspect of this on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, under the Cabinet Office, we have the Rapid Response Unit, which is a Cabinet Office unit which is there to effectively track what people are doing in social media. So it's looking at what I'm doing, what many other people are doing in the UK on social media. The National Security Communications Team is all about making sure the right narrative appears in the mainstream press. 77th Brigade is, many of you will have heard of before, is a British military group which again spies on UK and also foreign conversations on social media in order to build a picture of who's speaking to whom, but also what are they talking about. 13th Signals is something similar. The Department of Culture, Media and Sport Fake News Unit is very similar to the Rapid Response Unit, just another example of that. And then possibly the most dangerous of the lot of this is the Freedom of Information Clearinghouse. And this is basically a list of special people in the UK that the government considers should not be communicated with by the various government departments. So if we want to make a freedom of information request to a particular government department, of course we make that request directly to that government department. But if you are on that special list, that freedom of information request would not be answered by the government department. That would be sent to the FOI clearinghouse in the Cabinet Office for them to respond to. So that's just one other aspect of this. We're going to come back on the 77 Brigade in 1 second. But before we do that, well, in fact, we'll do that now, because here's Big Brother Watch, another NGO in the UK. It's not universally liked, but nonetheless, they do some useful work from time to time. They were making the point that 77 Brigade had not just been spying on, alternative media people or activists or people on social media, but had been spying on Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, Conservative MPs David Davis and Chris Green, academics from Oxford University and University College London, journalists including Peter Hitchens and Julia Hartley-Brewer, and in fact many others that have been critical of government policy, and so on. So this was something that came to light. Many people have been talking about it for a number of years, but it certainly ended up on the floor of the House of Commons 3 or 4 months ago. And Ben Wallace, who was the Secretary of State for Defence at the time, said that he would be running an investigation into the activities of 77th Brigade. But as everybody will expect, nothing has been heard about that since. The other aspect I want to remind everybody of is this, the Counter Disinformation and Media Development Programme within the Foreign Office. And this was the original head of that, Andy Price. He's no longer, he retired from this particular job, went off somewhere else in 2018 or 2019, and he was replaced by this guy, Darren Boyling. But that particular organization was responsible for Integrity Initiative, if you remember, the organization that was running cells of journalists and other think tankers and so on, in order to build a narrative against Russia in particular at that time. But anyway, that was what that organization was doing. But if we think about the media development aspect of this, this is very much about the British establishment sending journalists into other countries to train local journalists in those countries, to help those local journalists become future correspondents to present Western narratives from foreign countries. Now, getting back onto the censorship side in particular, I want to just make the point that many of the people that have been speaking out over the last number of years have been on the receiving end of direct attacks from the mainstream press. So one such person is my colleague, Piers Robinson. He's a former academic. He was a professor at Sheffield University. He is a specialist on propaganda and disinformation. But because he was working, or has been working closely with the OPCW whistleblowers on the fake chemical weapons attack in Douma in Syria, he has been targeted in this case by the Times and accused of sharing, as you can see, conspiracy theories. Now, it didn't just end with OPCW, because of course they want to highlight anything that he may or may not have said. So he was accused here of pushing coronavirus conspiracy theories. He was also accused of pushing 9/11 conspiracy theories, and so on. Not just him, but others. Tim Hayward, another colleague, both of the Piers and Tim worked with me on the media on trial events that we ran while the Syrian war was at its height. So they have both been on the receiving end. Of course, Vanessa Beeley, who many people will know, has been on the receiving end. But in fact, while the Times attacks were quite tame, and they were front page attacks, they were detrimental to Piers' academic career for certain, because he ended up having to leave his job at Sheffield University as a result. They were not life-threatening. But the attack on Vanessa Beeley has been much worse. So to say the Douma attack was staged is to enter an Orwellian world, is what the Times said. But the BBC ran an entire series, an entire radio podcast series on Vanessa Beeley. They called it Mayday, after Mayday Rescue, who she had been heavily criticizing, and the White Helmets and so on. But this particular article, Mayday, how the White Helmets and James Le Mesurier, who was the guy who set up the White Helmets, got pulled in a deadly battle for truth. In this particular article, the BBC published a photograph of Vanessa Bailey's car and the number plate on her car. Now, if she lived in the UK, perhaps that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But Vanessa lives in Damascus, in Syria, and therefore this was clearly a direct effort by the BBC to effectively bring about her death, because inevitably she was being outed in what was at that time a war zone. It still is to some degree, slightly, as the attack a couple of days ago on the military passing out parade, the graduation parade for military officers shows. We at the UK column have been on the receiving end of the Times, and the Times don't worry too much about the truth, because aside from using extremely old images of my colleague Brian Gerrish, they choose to put images of people that have no association with the UK column whatsoever, and most of the text in this article was absolutely untrue. So although they haven't taken the article down, they have placed a note on the article to make the point that we dispute the comments that were made in it. But something else has begun to happen in the last, following the Alex Jones court case. There's an effort to bring similar kinds of action in this country. And the first thing here is an article from the BBC, because a commentator in the UK called Richard D. Hall published some articles on a terrorist attack in Manchester, the Manchester Arena, where he was questioning some of the stories around that particular event. And as a result, the BBC not only stalked Richard D. Hall, they have now encouraged some of the people affected in the Manchester Arena event to take a court case against Richard D. Hall, much in the same way that Alex Jones was attacked. It didn't end there. Of course, the most famous recent attack has been on Russell Brand. And this was the BBC's article of this, Russell Brand accused of rape and sexual assault. But there was one sentence in this that piqued my interest, because it said this: the Sunday Times said all the women felt ready to speak only after being approached by reporters. And I think this is extremely telling. This is a new development where the mainstream press is getting directly involved in encouraging people to either make allegations of impropriety or to take court cases against anybody that's attempting to counter the mainstream narrative. But the Russell Brand story is particularly interesting because this lady on the left-hand side is Caroline Dinenage, and she is the chairwoman of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, and that's supposed to hold the Department of Culture, Media and Sport to account. But she wrote a letter about Russell Brand to Rumble, the online video hosting platform, and to TikTok, demanding that both platforms demonetize Russell Brand's content, despite the fact that at the moment there are still only allegations against Russell Brand. He has not been found guilty in any kind of court of law. So she wrote that letter demanding that. But here's the thing: her husband, Mark Lancaster, Baron Lancaster on the right-hand side there, who is currently the Armed Forces Minister, that's a junior minister in the Ministry of Defence, he was 77 Brigade. In fact, he wasn't just, not like Tobias Elwood, just a Lieutenant Colonel in 77 Brigade. He was Deputy Commander of 77 Brigade. So here we have a nice little clique that this pair, where she is taking action to try to persuade platforms to demonetize people on the basis of nothing proven in a court. You've got to ask the question, where was the influence to do that coming from? She did it on her own without consulting the other members of her committee, by the way. And finally, we cannot forget the media attack, the constant media attack on Julian Assange. And if we think about Russell Brand and the fact that these claims are about sexual impropriety, of course, the attack on Julian Assange began with a claim of sexual impropriety, which ended up being false, or at least was dropped. And so he still remains in Belmarsh prison, waiting to be extradited to the United States, having not been actually convicted of anything. This continues to be the most disgusting case of miscarriage of justice, I think, and the most chilling case of censorship of a journalist that we've seen so far. Now, it doesn't just apply to media attacks on journalists, it's also police attacks. And I did mention this before, but I'll mention it again. And that was the editor of a French magazine arrested in the UK as he entered the UK at Heathrow Airport as a result of Schedule 7 of the Anti-Terrorism Act. This is as you can see on screen there, a national security port and border power. It says this enables the examining officer, to stop, search, question, and detain a person traveling through a port or airport or the border area. This is to determine whether the person is or has been involved in the commission, preparation, or instigation of acts of terrorism. Now, of course, this French journalist, the only thing he had done was to write about the protests that had been going on in France over pensions at the time. But many others have been on the receiving end of the same treatment, again, including Vanessa Bailey. And what happens when you arrive at a UK airport or port and you're arrested in this way is that you're sat for 6 hours being questioned. Your laptop, your mobile phone are taken from you, and you are required to give your passwords. And if you do not give your passwords, you are then looking at a prison sentence in the UK. So that's more chilling effect on journalism and so on. Now, I just want to remind everybody that we have another lovely piece of legislation, because if we are campaigning against, or if we are even just in a group that are pushing out narratives counter to the mainstream narrative, we are subject, and many campaign groups in the UK have been subject to covert intelligence gathering by the police, and in some cases illegal activity has taken place. I just want to remind everybody of this. The Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Act, as it now is, this was the documentation as it was going through Parliament, but let's just remind you what it said. This was a bill to make provision for and in connection with the authorization of criminal conduct in the course of or otherwise in connection with the conduct of covert human intelligence sources. So if the police decide to infiltrate your organization in the UK or to infiltrate your media group, they can do that, and they can do that without any concern that any illegal activity that they may enter into in the course of that will not be prosecutable. And it doesn't define what the limits of that illegal activity are. And just to remind everybody, which organizations are allowed to do this? Well, it's any police force, as you would expect, the National Crime Agency, the Serious Fraud Office, any of the intelligence services, you might expect that as well, any of Her Majesty's forces, armed forces that is, Her Majesty's Revenue of Customs, that's tax collectors, the Department of Health and Social Care, the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the Competition and Markets Authority, the Environment Agency, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Food Standards Agency, the Gambling Commission. All these organizations are currently in the UK allowed to infiltrate anybody they see as being a threat, and they're allowed to break the law in any of the activities that they are carrying out to manage that infiltration. So what's the role then of the think tanks and the NGOs? Let's just bring one example on screen, and that's the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And as you can see, they're talking about that they power solutions to extremism, hate, and disinformation. One of their targets, January the 6th there, you can see another one of the targets, Elon Musk. Various targets that they like to promote, but let's just, well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, is an issue that they want to deal with. But ISD partners with governments, cities, businesses, and communities, working to deliver solutions at all levels of society to empower those who can really impact change, headquartered in London with a global footprint that includes Washington, Berlin, Amman, Nairobi, and Paris. And they go on to say they combine sector-leading expertise in research in global extremist movements with an advanced digital analysis capability. With this, we identify and track online manipulation, disinformation, hate, and extremism in real time. Our digital analysis unit has built proprietary tools delivering social science standards of data and so on. You can see what they're talking about. But they say that crucially, they work to empower civil society, fostering networks of community influencers, including the first and largest global network of former extremists that have the credibility to reach hard to reach target audiences. They've trained over 32,000 activists and social influencers around the world and have pioneered the first of their kind intervention models across different online spaces. So this is all about narrative control, attempting to intervene with anybody that's telling the truth, let's say. So the term that Harley has used in the past to describe this whole infrastructure is a disinformation industrial complex. I can't remember where this term originated, but let's just summarize with some of the features that we're talking about here. The first is the fusion doctrine. This was something that appeared in a UK Ministry of Defence review, strategic defence review. And basically what it means is government, intelligence agencies, military, police, media, social media platforms, NGOs, think tanks, and what are called influencers, all working together to try to maintain a particular narrative. It requires that the government provides a foundation for approved media. So when we look at Section 181 of the Online Safety Bill Act as it is now, and they are talking about approved media not being subject to certain clauses, which may result in prison sentences. That's what I'm talking about. I'll be talking about that a little bit more in a second. The idea of trust is key. So we've got the Trusted News Initiative and various other trust bodies which are promoting the idea that the mainstream media can be trusted. In fact, it's only the mainstream media that can be trusted for the news. Nobody else can be trusted. You've got to trust them because, of course, if you trust the mainstream media, you can switch your brain off. It can dribble out your nose. You don't have to have a brain anymore. The mainstream media tells you what to think, and that's all you need to know. And then finally, the rise of the trust in the fact-checking industries is a feature of this. But the other feature of it, and it's a narrative that we see right across the world, is that the reason that we've got to have this infrastructure, this disinformation industrial complex, is because of terrorism. That was the original narrative when David Cameron was talking about this in 2015. But eventually, child safety and child protection became the big issue of the day, the big cause célèbre to justify censorship. So these are fronts for the censorship regime. It doesn't end in the UK with the Online Safety Act because the UK is about to bring a media bill. This is the next stage. Now, one of the very key features, in parallel with all this infrastructure being built, one of the key features that the government was very concerned about back in 2018 was that the mainstream press was in financial difficulty. And so this was Matt Hancock speaking. He was the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport at the time. He was speaking in 2018, talking about real threats to our media. That's their media. If an individual published it online, it would be untouched by media regulation. So he's very worried that the mainstream press had to meet certain regulatory obligations, but that individuals could basically publish whatever they like on the mainstream, on social media and so on. So he said that he would tremble at the thought of a media regulated by the state. He, in fact, was trembling with excitement because he knew very well that not only the mainstream media, but all media was going to be regulated by the state in the very near future. But he was announcing at that time a review, the Cairn Cross review, which was looking at the the situation with the press and how the press could be given some decent foundations. Now, the irony here is, and perhaps some good news for once, the irony here is that the press hasn't been saved by the Cairn Cross review and by what the government intervention at the time. because this little piece of data came to light a few days ago. This is from Axios, and they're talking about the number of referrals that mainstream media organizations have been receiving from Facebook and X, Twitter, over the past few years. So this begins in the middle of 2020. And you can see there the yellow line is Facebook, that people, this was monthly referrals. So in the UK, Facebook was referring people 120 million times to mainstream media stories over in mid 2020. It's fallen to roughly 21 million per month now, and that is a really spectacular fall. So we've just zoomed in on that a little bit, and you can see. So this is what they said, why it matters. Website business models, that's mainstream media, website business models that depend on clicks for social media are now broken. And they're saying that this is because of regulatory pressure. So actually the online safety bill has completely failed to reinforce the mainstream media. It has effectively pulled the rug out from under it. So that's perhaps ironic, but it's a positive piece of news. Regulatory pressure and free speech concerns have pushed tech giants to abandon efforts to elevate quality information, that means mainstream information, leaving the public more susceptible to misinformation ahead of the 2024 election. So anyway, the point here is the effort from the government was to try to level the playing field so that the regulation that mainstream media is required to submit to would apply to other forms of media, alternative media, and other social media, and other forms of media as well. This is now being accelerated with the media bill, which is now coming through Parliament. And what they are going to do is to enable Ofcom to introduce a video on demand code to protect UK audiences from harmful material. So video on demand content, stuff that appears on YouTube in particular, which while YouTube is particularly egregious with respect to censorship, this is now going to be formalized in law as well. Now, just to finish off here, I've talked about the UK, but the question is what's happening in other parts of the world? Well, there's very similar legislation either already in place in other parts of the world or about to be. So if we look at the EU, first of all, we've got the Digital Services Act, which is ensuring a safe and accountable online environment. And this will start to come into force in February 2024. It's already having an effect on social media companies because they're getting prepared for its full implementation in Feb next year. However, what remains to be seen is exactly what Twitter is going to do, because of course Elon Musk has been quite robust in his response to this type of thing and his refusal to censor people since he took over. So it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of response he has to this in the early part of next year. Ireland has its Online Safety and Media Regulation Act 2022, which is just as draconian as the UK's one. Canada has the Online News Act. Now, this is less about censorship and more about underpinning the mainstream press, because this is about trying to make sure that the mainstream press gets what the Canadian government perceives as being the right amount of money from the online platforms like Google and Facebook and Twitter and so on. But they also have a new piece of legislation on its way called it received royal assent in April 2023. So this has passed the Online Streaming Act, which is a Censorship Act, and they have other legislation as well. Here we have Australia moving on online safety. Now let's just see what this says. They have passed their legislation, but the legislation is similar to the UK in many ways. It's an enabling act. So following on from the legislation, the various bodies have to then decide how to implement that. And so what this article is saying is that various organizations, various groups of organizations, they're calling it 5 codes, are being created in order to cover those 5 areas. So social media, application distribution, website hosting services, internet service providers, and also equipment that's used on the internet. So Australia well on its way to imposing the same type of scenario as the UK. New Zealand, probably of the Five Eyes countries, New Zealand probably the furthest behind on this. They have only just completed their public consultation on safer online services and media platforms. The point is, all these countries are going to end up with more or less the same regime. It started with the UK. They designed the online harms bill, online harms white paper. I think in 2019 was when they published that. That basically informed what every other country in the Western world is doing. And so we're going to see the similar types of legislation in all these countries. It's potentially going to have a massively chilling effect on the ability for anybody to speak out in any of those countries. And while the US has supposedly free speech written into the Constitution, and you don't have this type of legislation, certainly not to the degree that we're seeing in the UK and Europe. Nonetheless, the types of policies that are being imposed by the legislation that we're producing will filter through into the way the terms and conditions are imposed in the United States as well. So that's what I have for you. We can talk about maybe what we do about this, Dennis, at some point.
Thank you, Mike. Actually, Dennis, I know you have a response to what he just said. Yeah, so go ahead.
Well, there are some other things that we'll be discussing, but as usual, Mike has left some people speechless, some people with a lot of questions. And I think the only thing I want to respond to saying, so that everybody who's watching this gets some idea to say, well, aren't we, we're talking about London all of a sudden. No, actually, we're talking about you. We're talking about exactly what's going on in Washington right now, exactly why Donald Trump is in the position he's in, or the American presidency is in the position it's in. The names, Christopher Steele, Richard Harrington, Sir Richard Dearlove, Sir Kim Darroch, all these people that you remember or should remember from the time of the prosecution of Trump during the period of 2017-2018, the flooding the zone initiatives of London come back in full force here, and I think in a few minutes we'll be taking more of a look at this around Canada. So it's the Five Eyes. We're talking about United States, Great Britain, and Canada. The only ones left out right now are Australia and New Zealand. Then I think that's important because none of what seems to be local in the American circumstance is local. Also, what I found most interesting here, Mike, which I wanted you've already talked about it, but there were two elements. One was the protest pens, which I think you described, and I think it's very important for people to just think about what that's all about. But the other was this Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Now, we've talked about this before, but one of the more interesting elements of what you said and what your graphic showed is this training of 32,000 operatives who operate in various ways, more or less organizers, really. And I think what's relevant there is that when people are going online and looking at so-called activist groups or various blogs or other things, if you would say a little bit about how, obviously, once you got a large enough group of people like that trained, there's sort of a kind of like a non-governmental organization version of an intelligence service, seems to me. In other words, you got kind of forward, deployment of intelligence operatives masquerading as being media or being activists or whatever. So I don't know if you have any more to say about that, but I think both of those things are really interesting.
So on the protest pen thing, one of the narratives that every country that's imposing this regulatory regime on the internet is saying is this will maintain the right to freedom of speech. Of course it doesn't, but that's what they claim. But then in the next sentence, they always say, but you have no right to be heard. So if you're shadow banned on Twitter, if you're or Facebook, if you're delisted from Google search, you have no right to be heard. So they have the right, therefore, to make sure that you can never be found by anybody on the internet. And So that is why I'm describing these as protest pens. What they're attempting to do is to corral people into a very close-knit community where people are effectively talking to each other instead of getting out and organizing people that aren't aware of the information that this group is aware of. You know, we want to go and organize people and encourage people to think. Well, if you're stuck inside your protest pen and you're only talking to each other, and in some cases arguing with each other, then you're not out organizing people. And of course, when we're talking about organizations like the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and their 32,000 activists, these are influencers. They're not necessarily just influencers. They might be disruptors. So you create your protest pen, you get a couple of nice disruptors in there, you get everybody that's in the protest pen arguing with each other, and you get your disruptor to just put a little bit of needle in there for once in a while. Everybody's focused on each other. Everybody's attacking each other. They're not attacking the government. They're not attacking the think tanks that are producing policy. They're not getting out and organizing people to start to join in the attack on the government and the think tanks that are developing the policy. They're just arguing amongst themselves. It effectively corrals all the opposition, all the resistance to what's going on, and it's extremely dangerous. And I think it's something that everybody needs to be aware of. In America, in the UK, in Europe, everywhere, we need to understand the types of tactics that are being used to control narratives. And so this absolutely, although I was talking about the UK, I'm illustrating a point with the UK. It applies equally in the United States and in every other Western country.
I have other things. Wait.
Okay, so I actually want to go now to a clip, another section of Putin's remarks. This is actually regarding the Nazi SS incident that you had in the Canadian Parliament, and then afterwards we'll go to someone else who will be joining us. So, Jose, you could just play that clip if you have it.
As for your question, we haven't agreed. We haven't agreed on you asking this question, but I was expecting it, to be honest. Moreover, I took this information about what actually happened. This is not just an ordinary event for us. I'll remind you that this division where that Nazi was serving, Ukrainian Nazi that you mentioned, was created by her command on the 28th of April 1940. Nuremberg trial, not us. It wasn't us yesterday, or it wasn't us today. Nuremberg tribunal announced that Galicia division of SS, criminal and responsible for genocide of Jews, Polish and other peaceful population. And this was a decision by International Nuremberg Trial. And I would like to remind you that it was independent prosecutors and judges that were making this decision based on the data that was provided by prosecutors from various countries. So that division was announced to be criminal. I would like to remind you, I took this information, that paper on purpose. So what the speaker said of the Canadian Parliament, he said, today in this room we have a Ukrainian-Canadian veteran of the Second World War who was fighting for independence of Ukraine against the Russians. I am proud that I could say that he is a hero of Ukraine and hero of Canada, and we are grateful to him for his service. First of all, if the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament is saying that during the Second World War, this Canadian or Canadian-Ukrainian or Ukrainian-Canadian fought against Russians during the Second World War, he cannot be ignorant of the fact that he was fighting on the side of Hitler and not on the side of his own country, Canada. Or he was collaborating with the Nazis. In any case, he was fighting on the side of Nazis. Let's assume that he did not know this. I'm not trying to offend the feelings of Canadians. We are respectful of people despite everything. If he doesn't know that during the war, it was Hitler who was fighting against Russians, and Hitler and his helpers was fighting against Russia. If he is not aware of this, he's an idiot. Then he just did not do well in school. He just doesn't have a elementary knowledge. But if he is aware that he was fighting on the side of Hitler, and he's calling him a hero of Canada and hero of Ukraine, then he's an evil person. He's a scoundrel. So these are the people we have to deal with. So these are the people we have to deal with in some Western countries. What's also important here is, so he said that the Speaker of Canada says that he fought the Russians, and then he now continues to support the Ukrainian military fighting against Russians. So he placed effectively on the same side those who were collaborating with Hitler and those who are fighting with Russians today. He put them on one side. This just emphasizes the fact that one of our goals in Ukraine is to denazify Ukraine, and what that means is that it exists there. The Nazis exist there, and so our objective is to denazify. And of course, what looks completely repulsive is that everyone is applauding this Nazi, especially the president of Ukraine, who's got Jewish blood. He is there standing applauding a Nazi, not just somebody who just follows that Nazi ideology. It's somebody who actually killed people with his hands. So German Nazis created this Galicia division in order to kill the civil population. And this is what is being stated by a Nuremberg trial. So about 150,000 Polish people were killed, and Russians, of course. Gypsies were not even counted. They did not even count them as people. So they said in the region of 1.5 million Jews were killed in Ukraine. Just think about that figure. What, is no one aware of this? It did not happen? Everyone knows. Everyone is aware. Was there no Holocaust? And when the president of Ukraine is applauding somebody who was killing the Jews with his own hands, is he trying to say the Holocaust did not happen? This is repulsive. But what they're saying is that all means are good as long as they're fighting against Russia. All means are good, acceptable, as long as they are used against the fight in the fight against Russia. So they have this desire to. I understand they have the desire to win on the battlefield and achieve the strategic defeat of Russia, but can you do this at this cost? Counting on not just us here in the small circle here at the Valdai discussion forum, we're talking about this. I'm hoping that organizations and forums, those who are not indifferent to the future of humanity, they should form their opinion about this and express their opinion about this.
Okay. I want to introduce someone else to the panel. He's our friend Fred Haight, who's actually from Canada and a longtime LaRouche member. So Jose, if you could just bring him on the panel. Great. Hi, Fred.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're loud and clear.
Okay, all right, good. Well, first of all, Mike, it's very good to meet you, and thank you for that inspiring and extremely detailed analysis. And much of what you're saying, I want to talk a little bit about that online news act that you recalled. Bill C-18. The bill is being presented not as censoring news. In fact, it's being presented as the exact opposite. It's going to give you more free choice in your news because it's going to eliminate certain financial advantages that one corporation might have over another. That's bunk. So far, Facebook and Instagram, or Meta, the company that runs both of them, as well as they have come out and said that the only thing that we can do to respond to this legislation is to refuse to allow the posting of either news items, news articles, or news videos. Canadians are simply just not allowed to post any news article or any news video. They can't prevent someone overseas from posting it, but you can't open it in Canada. I've tried to open articles posted by my sister, by good friends of mine, and it just says, you're not allowed to read this. And then you go to Meta and their explanation, they act as though they're quite outraged about it, saying, basically, we are beginning to shut down the availability of news in Canada. You can't get it on the internet anyway. I've heard some of the mainline media in Canada arguing that this is just Meta and Facebook arguing, using their own censorship and blaming it on the Canadian government. I don't think that's the case. Of the two thieves, I know which one I would rather believe. So that's a situation that we are finding in ourselves, of increasing censorship. And on this business of Jaroslav Hunka speaking in front of the Canadian Parliament and receiving these standing ovations, a lot of people said, oh, this is good. They've exposed themselves. Dennis Speed said, no, it's a test. And I wasn't quite sure what he meant, but I can see it right now. It is a test for the people as to whether they are going to accept the shock of saying, what on hell has our government been up to over the last decades? We really have to look at that. Or whether they will be allowed themselves to be stampeded into a war against Russia through the overwhelming narrative of disinformation that is coming out of the media. Canada itself has a government disinformation webpage. It has a specific part of that webpage dedicated specifically to Russia. And in it, they will list various incidents, and they will say, well, here's the truth of what happened in this incident. Here's what the Russians say happened. No proof, no discussion, no back and forth, anything. It's just like, you're supposed to believe what we say here. The press has been full of charges of disinformation coming out of the Russians in the case of this. The most prominent speaker has been one Marcus Kolga, who is the senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which itself has been banned from Russia and China for, guess what, spreading disinformation. But he also is the founder of Disinfo Watch, and he's the guy who's quoted most in the media. I'm just going to read you a couple of the things that he said. He said, I've never seen the sort of frenzy the Russian propagandists have gone into over the past number of days, exploiting this situation and trying to intensify the already damaging effects that it's having on our reputation abroad, but also the divisions that this could possibly cause within our own society. It is embarrassing for the Canadian government, but I think this is something that would go away relatively quickly when it comes to the international media. But when it comes to the Russian media and the Russian state propagandists, they are going to continue to use this. They will use it for the coming weeks, months, and years. Now, Mr. Kolga has been involved in spreading his own disinformation. He brought to the attention of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation an image that he claimed had been posted on the Russian embassy website in the UK of a new Ukrainian stamp with a picture of Hunka on it, claiming him to be a hero. They would have had to do this within a couple days of the speech, but the stamp turned out to be a fraud, of course, and it was removed. But the Russian embassy also says they didn't do it. And now the media attacks on it are saying, well, it was posted on pro-Russian websites. They're no longer saying that it was even posted on the website of the Russian embassy to the UK. So here you have a case of the people supposedly fighting disinformation, creating even greater and greater levels of it. This has always been the case. When Chrystia Freeland's grandfather was exposed for having run this newspaper, News from Krakow, pro-Nazi newspaper, for several years, she called it Russian disinformation. And until it was actually proven that it was the case. Now, there is in Canada, in Alberta, in the University of Alberta, there is what they call the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies. It is the second largest center of Ukrainian studies in the world outside of Ukraine and Russia, with Harvard being number one, actually. But this center has been around since 1976. They are working on a project of creating a Ukrainian encyclopedia, which covers about 1/3 of its budget. And they also actively campaign in promoting bilingual education in Alberta since its inception. Chrystia Freeland grew up in this environment and was trained to be fluent in Ukrainian from at least 8 years old. But I just want to say one thing. We're going to see the level of disinformation, saying to be against disinformation, multiplying. I just listened this morning to a presentation by a major fellow of that institute, Miroslav Slankish. I think I'm pronouncing it right. He has written a 500-page book on the 14th Waffen-SS, the Galician Division. And what he was saying is the biggest cover-up I've ever heard, saying that, well, first of all, the intellectuals who founded it and volunteered enthusiastically were mostly wiped out in war, and for the next generation, the Nazis drafted Ukrainians. Secondly, they were one of the few SS units that were allowed chaplains, I think priests most likely, which he said negated the Nazi doctrine, I think most likely absolved them from it. Thirdly, that they were only allowed to fight on the Eastern Front and only for the liberation of Ukraine. And then most incredibly, he says there were about 4,000 Ukrainians who were destined for this 14th Galician SS, but the Nazis wanted some policing units, so they created 4 police regiments and put about 1,000 people in each of them. And the guy admitted that, yes, they did murder Poles and others, they did commit atrocities, but he says they weren't really the 14th Galician Waffen-SS, but people thought they were because those sneaky Nazis gave them the insignia of the Galician 14th, which was a lion with 3 crowns on it, so the people thought it was the 14th Division, but it really wasn't. Well, excuse me, it was the same Nazis who were recruiting the 14th and who were setting up these policing divisions, and he's trying to make such a sophistic division. But nevertheless, that's the kind of stuff that is coming up and that's being thrown against people. And it is a test. It's a test as to whether people will actually have the courage to face the truth about what's going on and what's been going on by their own government. There have been commissions in Canada. There was a commission in 1985 called the Deschênes Commission, which found that, in fact, the accusations of huge numbers of Nazis, many as many 3,000, coming to Canada after the war with relative ease was true. So the truth is right out there, but as the Rand Corporation put it a while back, they said, whose narrative is going to win here? And they think, well, we have the sheer power to just overwhelm everything. So the tendency that we're seeing right now is to see the entire incident written off as Russian disinformation. That's what I'll say for
Thanks,
now. There's
Fred.
more going on. Yeah, there's more going on in Canada if you want to know later too.
Great. Do any of our other panelists have responses? Dennis?
Sure. I have something to say about it. Yeah, because it doesn't really matter how it's being written off as Russian disinformation, as is obvious. What's happening actually is that Trudeau can easily go. There are reasons that that would occur. They have very little to do, by the way, with various forces in Canada. Uh, we just saw what Vladimir Putin had to say about that at the Valdai Club discussion. So, as far as he's concerned, that's part of their strategic evaluation about the conscious knowledge by forces in NATO of the Nazi nature and characteristic of the Ukrainian forces at this point. I mean, we're not talking about the Ukrainian people. We're not even talking about a lot of the Ukrainian soldiers, because a lot of those people are now just being drafted, as we know, dragged off the street. There's all sorts of things happening. But what can't be denied is that what occurred in the parliament could not have been other than the action of morons and multiple morons, or a conscious action. And in either of those cases, if it was a deliberate action to, in other words, promote that element, and to do that in Zelensky's presence, perhaps with Zelensky's complicity, then in either case, that entire governmental structure needs to be removed. And this, to say that that's merely my or anybody else's evaluation, misses the point that there's certain things that act historically independent of what people believe will happen. It sort of reminds me of a situation back in 1989 around the Berlin Wall. If you would talk to any so-called pundit, they would have told you it was absolutely impossible that the Berlin Wall was going to come down. Or how it would happen and how that destabilization would occur. But it happened. It's not a matter of being hopeful, it's a matter of really understanding what this particular incident has generated. It's sort of like looking at the same thing that Mike reported about the unintended consequence of the surveillance and censorship regime on the actual British so-called mainstream media. That you can create a circumstance, in other words, where you plan too well, and you blow things up in a different way. The only other thing I wanted to say as a whole, because every time you bring this topic up, particularly in the United States, you have a lot of cowardly people who are always willing to talk about something other than what they actually have to do about a circumstance. And the issue in terms of the Congress of the United States right now is that, looking at what happened in Canada and looking in this case at the way Vladimir Putin responded to it, how do you justify financing this war, especially looking at the state of the United States? See, so just looking at the infrastructure of the United States, the conditions of homelessness, and all the other things that one could add up. And at a deficit, with a deficit budget. So there are things that can suddenly come into play here, which are way different than what you would, I think, assume. So that's just two responses I have. I do have another question at some point for Mike, but I can leave that off. Maybe others have comments.
Sure. Mike, do you have anything?
No.
Okay. Dennis, why don't you go ahead and ask your question then?
Yeah, Mike. Yeah. So let's go back. You brought up toward the end of your presentation the whole Russell Brand business. Now, Brand, I think now has something like a 6.5 million subscribers on his platform. How does that compare? Because of course we think of him, we see him here in the United States, but he of course is a UK-based phenomenon. But how does that compare in terms of his outreach prior, particularly to the charges, to, let's say, BBC or other of the media outlets? What kind of threat was he seen to represent? And how is it that his case is being used to sort of advance this broader agenda? And has there been any blowback from that?
His reach is significantly greater than with certain demographics, his reach is significantly greater than any mainstream media. He's got a following which certainly the print media could only dream about. The BBC is the BBC is funded by a license fee. It's basically a tax that every household has to pay if they want to watch live television. And it doesn't matter if you're watching any live television of any provider, you still have to pay the television license, which funds the BBC, even if you don't watch the BBC. So your choice is to if you don't want to fund the BBC, you've got to stop watching all live television. And people are doing that. People are doing that in huge numbers. The reason that the idea of trust is such a central part of this disinformation industrial complex. The reason that they are trying to convince people that there is a trusted media and an untrusted media is because there's a recognition within the mainstream media that they are basically untrusted by the majority of people now. And Russell Brand, as with his populist approach to things has captured a lot of people that have just been absolutely turned off by the lies that they've been told going back 20, 30. I mean, people I think really started to become jaded about the mainstream press with the Iraq war and the way that the press beat the war drums and supported Tony Blair in the action that he took in ignoring the peace protests that happened at the time. For the Stop the War coalition in 2003 to get 1 million or 1.5 million people out on the streets was unprecedented, really, for this type of political protest, and for the public to make that statement as strongly as they did at that time, and then for Tony Blair to ignore it and go to war in Iraq anyway. Lots of people never forgive. Blair's unredeemable, but lots of people never forgive the BBC and the other mainstream press, and they've been becoming more and more turned off by that ever since. So he has, without question, because he had already a very high profile in his younger years as an entertainer on mainstream television. So he had a base from which he was able to build whenever he started making comment about things, and so that's why he has the audience that he has, because he was basically unstoppable. Whereas others who have tried to build things from scratch don't have the audience that he has, because they never had the resource that he had. So that's not a criticism of him in any way. The fact is, Dennis, that he never hid his proclivities from the beginning. He was absolutely open about everything that he had done and everything that happened in his early years, and he never hid the type of person that he was. But at some point, he decided that he was going to speak out on issues, and that became a major threat because of his already established audience. And so this is without question an effort to finally shut him down. And we've seen similar efforts with, I have no particular trust of or like of Nigel Farage, for example, but the fact of the matter is there has been for a long time a concerted effort to shut him up. And the recent issue of him having his bank accounts withdrawn was an example of that. But there have been other commentators and activists over the last lot of years that have been on the receiving end of similar treatment. It's just that Russell Brand happens to be a particularly high profile one.
Well, you see, the reason this is relevant as far as I'm concerned is look at Tucker Carlson. The same sort of thing occurred in that case.
Right, but Dennis, the attack on Russell Brand only came after he started appearing on Tucker Carlson's program. And so I think it was the combination of those two things. So it was the fact that Brand was bringing his audience to Carlson and vice versa was the tipping point on this one.
So this sort of takes us back to the protest pens point that you're making, because as you were saying, the internet process, as it in the early days, created a circumstance in which you began to get these audiences that were being assembled that weren't within the categories of either left or right or other sorts of categories. Certainly, also, it's been noticed by LaRouche forces, particularly since the February of this year, with the whole rage against the war machine business, that political barriers have broken down. Also, political institutions are also breaking down, and therefore there is a way in which people are no longer controlled or seeking to not be controlled. Then, of course, in the case of America in particular, there's the candidacy of RFK Jr., who is a bit similar to Russell Brand in that much of his campaign appeal, particularly to usual non-voters, has been his, I'm not going to call it confessional style. I'll say it's real. He talks about his 15 years of drug addiction. He talks about many other things. And of course, there's the fact that his father was assassinated, and much of his drug addiction and so on is directly attached to his reaction to the assassination of his father and the earlier assassination of his uncle. So these matters are suddenly being discussed in a fulsome way in the American context. And again, so Brandt and others are sort of couched in there. So I'd like to ask, I did ask, has there been any obvious pushback? Maybe there hasn't been that, but what's your sense of, given what you've been saying to us already about these laws, what's your sense about the vulnerability, I'm going to put it that way, the potential vulnerabilities of this surveillance operation being carried out by the sort of globally extended NATO intelligence apparatus?
Well, I mean, aside from what I've already hinted at, with the fact that their efforts aren't working, they aren't driving traffic to mainstream. Look, people aren't stupid, and they recognize when they're being lied to. And what the mainstream press and what the governments don't seem to grasp is that you can't force people to suddenly, by the fact that you are attempting to restrict their access to certain information, that isn't automatically going to make the information that you feed them on a plate edible, right? People are not accepting their story, and censorship isn't going to make people accept their story. So as a result, people are asking questions. I was traveling last weekend and was sitting in an airport lounge, and I just was the gate number hadn't been called yet, so I just sat down, and before I knew it, the guy behind me was on the phone talking about Russell Brand, decrying the fact that more people aren't waking up, or at least not fast enough for him, as he was putting it. But the point is, conversations like this were never happening before. They're happening all over the place. A random encounter in a random seat in an airport, they're happening all the time now. People are actively asking questions. They're ripe for the picking. If people are out, are into campaigning and organizing, people are ready for that. And that no censorship regime is going to beat that, because people's minds are already open to or at least recognizing that they have been lied to by the official channels for news or from government sources and so on. So there are massive opportunities available to us, and the more draconian the censorship becomes, it's self-defeating. It's the governments are shooting themselves in the foot. The more draconian they are, if they do arrest people and prosecute them for disseminating information that they claim that somebody knew to be false, as this new legislation permits, this is going to have the opposite effect. It's not okay. Somebody may end up going to prison, but there's going to be a recognition that that that's going on, that type of censorship is going on, and the censorship regime falls down at that point because people become absolutely aware of what it is. So I think we're already at the point where no matter how much the official narrative attempts to be shoved down people's throats, they just aren't having it, and so it will not win at the end of the day.
I agree with that. I think we're coming up on time, so let me just ask the both of you if you have any summary remarks, and then we'll close off. Dennis, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll just say a few things. I think what we've done today is to give people a pretty comprehensive view of, on the one hand, that circumstance, the sort of a state of affairs that confronts everybody. But I also think that that point that was made kind of in the thing you quoted from Lyndon LaRouche about this idea that there's a circumstance in which it appears that everything is impossible to stop. You simply look at what you would say to be the array of forces, but actually things aren't that way at all. That there are an actual intermediating series of circumstances that are evolving even as you speak, where suddenly things become possible that were not possible. Take, for example, the fact that these 4 senior German military and political officers put forward a peace proposal in Germany recently. And this has been something that Helga Zepp LaRouche of the Schiller Institute has been asking that people get out widely, and it began to be distributed and began to be discussed. Now, some people were saying, who are pundits and others and know the whole circumstance of everything, some people were saying, well, yeah, but the Russians aren't going to negotiate. So what is this really all about? Yeah, well, here's what it's about. Germany, which had Nord Stream 2, a terrorist action taken from anything that Seymour Hersh or some of us can tell, taken by NATO and specifically Washington, D.C. against the nation of Germany, needs somebody to speak up in Germany against what is a police state. We won't use the other term that people would come to mind, being imposed from the United States and London on Germany. So the fact that you have 4 senior figures that are saying, no, we reject the idea of the Ukraine war and the world war with Russia. We don't want to have Germany get involved in that again. Okay. The fact that there are some people that are doing that, well, what that does is it creates inside of Germany and among people, that nation, options for action that otherwise don't exist at a time where that government deserves to be toppled. Most emphatically, the so-called Green Party, which used to be the so-called Party of Peace, back when it was founded. For those of us who were around and active at that point, now the Green Party is the primary proponent of war. Really, despite the fact that it is impossible not to know the Nazi component of the Ukrainian forces that are being deployed. So that's a good example of a circumstance which it's an intermediating circumstance. The proposal may not be what happens, but the fact that it's being done. Same thing with the United States right now. The Congress of the United States. People say, well, the Congress never does anything right. That may be true, but it has nothing to do with whether or not you can take at a moment of destabilization when the whole question of the Speaker of the House has come up. And now, in fact, the deployment of any funds to Ukraine has been delayed, first of all. Second of all, was taken out of the appropriations bill. And third, there are probably now the majority of Americans don't want other money going to Ukraine unless they know, number one, what the victory strategy is, number two, what the exit strategy is, and number three, where the rest of the money went. That just would not seem to any reasonable person to be something that shouldn't be capable of being answered. But the truth is, it isn't capable of being answered. They don't have an answer for that, because if you were to actually start to do an audit, you may find there's not $130 billion or $260 billion or $390 billion. You could be running something like $1 trillion of various forms of criminal activity that could be documented by those that wish to do it. on the part of various of the forces involved in Ukraine. So, but we don't know what will happen if we cause an intervention into the Congress. I think that's the most important thing. We have to do it. Maybe it's possible to actually stop the war. We won't know until we try. And so I think that we have this week specifically that before the dust settles, that if we get people, whether you vote or you don't, by the way, to go in front of their congressional offices, maybe they can't go to Washington, but they go to their congressional office and they have a sign, no world war with Russia, or stop funding, Ukraine depopulation, which is what it is, Ukraine depopulation war. And you stand in front, 2 people, 3 people can do that. And then put that up on social media, exactly to do what Mike was just alluding to, which is that you break out of the protest pen and you create a circumstance where internationally you can do this. Not just I mentioned the United States, but you also could do this in any country. And if people say that that's what should happen, because everybody knows that the engine of the war is the financial coffers of the United States, that neither Great Britain nor France nor any of the other countries is capable of maintaining this war or maintaining people in the war. Okay, and so that is what I would say. I think it's a very, in that sense, hopeful circumstance. Finally, one other element just to continually remember. In the United States right now, there are 2 presidential candidates. There's RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr., and there's Donald Trump. Both of them are basically outlier candidates right now, but they're also the most popular candidates in the country. So the American people are going to have to figure out a way to actually change their entire circumstance. That is what they're going to have to do. And that is something that can be done by them. Usually can't, but this is a moment where that real change can happen, and it would be the best possible way to respond to the rise of parliamentary support for Nazism and maybe even congressional support for it that we saw in the Canadian Parliament.
I just want to add to that, Dennis. Helga had actually concluded in the weekly dialogue by saying, that we're trying to build this international peace coalition. We're trying to make it so powerful that its voice cannot be passed over. And that if you are a peace activist, or if you want to be a peace activist, to contact us and to make the activities of the IPC known to other people. You should absolutely get active with us, and that this isn't a moment to just contemplate. This is a moment when it is you and many individuals that can make a difference. So I would advise everyone watching to join our deployment to the Congress this upcoming week. Fred, Fred, you're back. I'll just ask you, we're wrapping up right now, if you have any summary remarks to what has been said.
No, not really. I mean, I've learned a lot from it, and no, I don't really have anything in particular to add to it, no.
Okay. Mike, you got anything to say?
No, not very much. I'll just make the point that often people don't want to become active because it's something that they're afraid to do. Just keep in mind that actually the people that are particularly afraid at the moment are our governments. They would not be imposing the type of legislation that they are imposing at the moment unless they were afraid of us. And in fact, they are so concerned about how effective alternative social media and alternative media and campaign groups like the LaRouche organization are. They are wanting to shut them down. That they recognize how effective that type of campaigning is. So we got to get over our fear and just get involved.
Okay. Dennis, Mike Robinson, Fred Haight, I want to thank you all for being a part of this meeting, and we'll see you next Saturday. So take care.
Okay.